Welcome back to another episode of the Born Again Again podcast. Today's Born Again Again story is an interview with a lovely man named David, who grew up in the Southern Church of Christ and left the faith later in life. During this interview, we talk about what it was like growing up in a Southern fundamentalist church, about having doubts as a kid but not really knowing how or who to express them to, about a conversation that he had with a coworker that completely changed his life, and about how common sense has to be a higher moral standard than any religious book. We wrap things up by discussing the difficulties in dealing with bitterness on the other side. As always, I hope you enjoy. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the show, David. I'm really happy that you're willing to talk to me today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk about things.
Yeah, definitely. So like I've been doing with the last couple, I would love if we could kind of start with where you're at now in terms of your Christian beliefs, where you're living, who you are, just kind of a brief introduction of who David is at this moment in time.
Okay. Well, I'm 49 years old and identify, I would say now, as an ex-Christian, probably first of all. And I first heard that term really with your podcast. And
oh, nice.
That's probably one of the strongest identifying factors I have. And then I'm, I would say, an agnostic atheist. I think like a lot of people identify, and that I don't make a claim that there is no God, but I have not seen enough evidence to convince me that there is. And so I don't really make a claim on the presence of a supreme being or creator. And I guess that that puts me in a bit in the agnostic category of whether we can know that or not. So
Sure.
I try not to make too much of a claim, but from what I've seen, if there is some kind of supreme being, it doesn't really care too much about what's going on down here.
Sure. Seems like a pretty reasonable place to stand. I think I'm with you in that. So you obviously haven't been that way your whole life. Tell me a little bit about your Christian background or your upbringing. Where did it start for you? When did you start calling yourself a Christian?
Well, I mean, I was born into a very fundamentalist Christian family. And so I grew up in the Church of Christ, which is fairly well known in the Southeast, especially in the area I am in Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi. There's a lot. And I think as you spread out from there, there's not so much. So just a brief description of the Church of Christ.
Yeah.
It's very much a non-centralized fundamentalist church that in general takes the Bible literally and is organized on a congregational level. And so there's no central organization. There are no central figures. There's no central statement. It's not like a Southern Baptist convention or anything. And so I was born into that fundamentalist culture with both my parents having strong lineages in the Church of Christ. And so my parents, my grandparents on both sides, their cousins, brothers, sisters, if you go vertically or horizontally in my family, you're going to find Church of Christ people. And that's not to say that there haven't been one or two, cousins that may not go to church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday
Right.
night. But
everyone has those cousins. There's always a couple cousins that don't quite fit into the mold.
Right. I have a first cousin that's been divorced, and I don't think that he's a real strong Church of Christ churchgoer. But I think that it's safe to say that it's really a familial heritage kind of thing. My grandfather was the preacher in the church that I grew up in, which was a congregation of about 250, sometimes up to 300 people. And I grew up sitting on the second row of a fairly large church, seeing my grandfather preach.
Wow.
And I mean, it's still really special to think about, because to me, in that church, he was kind of the essence of goodness to me. He was my grandfather. So of course I was biased and saw him a certain way. And then I heard him preach, and all of my family being that way, that's where really my strong Church of Christ fundamentalist background comes from.
Wow. All right. And so is that something that you grew up in? Is that something you kind of continued on through your life as you grew up as well?
I did. There wasn't really much of a choice, until you was out on your own a little bit. And, once you move away to college, it's not like I ever said I didn't want to go and my parents forced me, I mean, that wasn't even really an issue. That was not something that was going to happen. I was so deep into it with the familial roots. That wasn't a possibility. I would have had to have been a really strong, really bold person to do that. So in the Church of Christ, I guess what happens is that you have to willfully choose to become a follower of Christ. And it's through baptism and full immersion in water in a Church of Christ. Okay. It's not just saying a prayer or accepting Jesus as your personal Savior. The Church of Christ is a very legalistic version of Christianity, and especially the sect that I was in, which is known as a non-cooperative or non-institutional Churches of Christ, which is a very small sect even of the Churches of Christ. But in all of those, about the age of puberty, sometime around there, sometimes younger, sometimes a little bit past, most people to continue on in the Church of Christ will go forward at an invitation song, or I guess you refer to it as an altar call at some church, where you go forward and you confess in front of everybody that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died for your sins. And then they always have a baptismal somewhere in the church building that you go up into with a preacher or whoever you choose to baptize you. And that's kind of your willful claim that you are one of Christ's followers. And so I did that at about 13 years old. And so that of my real memories of when I really decided to accept it, that was about the age I did. It was either 12 or 13. Okay. So I was born in 1971, and so it would have been about 83 or 84 or so. And if you like, I could talk about that some, because they're, looking back on things now, I can remember some thoughts I had, and there's one particular that haunts me there. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to hear about it.
So having grown up around it, I didn't really question a lot. And you don't really question a lot, up through your 12th or 13th birthday, right? That's normal. But about that time, since you do have to make quite a commitment in that situation to go up in front of a couple hundred people, and then you get baptized in front of them, and it's kind of an emotional thing.
Sure.
I was trying to figure it out. And just my nature is that I'm an engineer. And then I became a doctor later in life when I went back to medical school. And my nature is to want to know why. Even now I look up root words to see why this word is said this certain way and what language it's from and what it really means. And part of that's medical training, going back to Latin and understand what things mean. But also my engineering background, I like to know how things work. I'll take them apart and put them back together sometimes. I'm very much an engineering type personality. And there was one thing that I really couldn't figure out about the Christian system. And I remember having this thought when I was 12. And I could not figure out why the death of one person or God/person a long time ago that I never really knew affected my relationship with another person that apparently had the ability to forgive or accept or reject me regardless of what that third party did. And, I don't know that I could have expressed it in those kind of words back then, but I really couldn't figure out why in the world that system was in place. It made no sense to me, because I can deal with a simple engineering reason as to why, or a simple thing like a purchase where you give money and you get something back for it, or even a personal relationship where you say, I'm sorry, I did that. I want to be on good terms with you again. And that person says, I accept and understand how you feel. But to have this impersonal third party sacrifice that was supposed to be such a great thing to make me acceptable to this other being that I never really have interaction with, I could not figure it out. Wow. And I couldn't really chase it. It's not like we had, access to the internet in 1983. I couldn't go, read Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or
sure.
I had no sources.
You're on your own. Yeah.
In North Alabama at the time. And even, your public schools aren't teaching evolution. There's no alternative narrative to things.
Sure.
And I wasn't very confident back then, I guess, as most 12-year-old boys. And I didn't think of myself as intelligent. And I thought whatever questions I had were probably pretty stupid. And so I didn't chase that reason. And I kind of embraced things from a practical standpoint, which is also my nature, realizing that I was in a family full of it. And here I am in this religion. Everything was going to get difficult if I didn't. And so I went forward and accepted everything and got baptized one day. And I'm in it when I did it. But I wish that I'd had the confidence to pursue that questioning, because I mean, little did I know that I had, and this is a phrase that you use on your show a lot, and you're the first one that introduced me to this, and it's really pretty brilliant, is as a 12-year-old stuck in that, I had zoomed out and seen the basic problem with the system, but I didn't have anybody else that had zoomed out or anybody to even bounce ideas off of.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I really appreciate about your podcast, is how much you talk about zooming out and seeing just the obvious, because when you're in it and you're grown in it, you can't see the obvious because so many people around you just believe it and you think that's normal, which is why we have to describe ourselves as ex-Christian, because the standard is a Christian, and to say you're an ex-Christian means I actually don't believe in that. It's an odd thing to describe yourself that way, but that's kind of what I remember about choosing to continue in the faith and taking it on myself. As far as being a child in it, my grandfather being a preacher helped, I think, because I saw the loving side of that, and I didn't think he was a harsh fire and brimstone preacher. But at the same time, I knew about the literal eternal hell that was awaiting all of us kind of by default before I can know. I mean, I don't remember not knowing about that,
Yeah. Yeah.
7. I mean, I sat through adult sermons as a child. It's not like they whisk off the children, and I'm not one where information just falls on me and rolls right off. If they were talking about eternal hell, I would have taken that in. So I don't remember ever not knowing it, and that was a huge impact to me.
Yeah. Do you feel like that? I mean, it sounds like it was a pretty fundamentalist institution in the way that they, talk about hell. Or why else would you consider that fundamentalist? Or kind of what were like the core experiences that you had in the church that kind of defined how you perceived the Church of Christ? What were like the feelings that went along with that?
So one of the slogans that they use about the Bible, and again, nothing is centralized or universal, but they had a slogan that said, "Speaks where the Bible speaks, and be silent where the Bible is silent." And that always rung true to me, not going beyond what it says, but also accepting what it says. And so for the most part, I was taught things like a literal creation story and the earth being, a young earth, 6,000 years old, give or take a little bit. Now, since the Church of Christ was not unified in everything, I was able to talk to my dad about things that didn't seem right. And you can work out your faith however you want to in the Church of Christ. And so you can talk about how things aren't 24-hour days or how God could have done it any way he wanted to. But it was a very fundamentalist approach to the Old Testament, and everything is real, and Jonah and the fish are real. The flood is real. God's wrath is certainly real. And then in the New Testament, of course, we take all that literally too, which is one reason that they did baptism by immersion, and there's no sprinkling or just saying a prayer. The example at times in the Bible is being baptized, and the way that was full immersion. Again, literal scriptures about homosexuality, we would then, the Church of Christ would never accept that, as far as I know. Now, that wasn't a real topic that people preached on back then, because it wasn't a big issue. But divorce was a bigger issue back then. While now it's accepted culturally in most churches, and even the Church of Christ, if a divorced person comes to join the church, you don't tell them, no, you can't join because you're married to your second wife. You accept them for who they are. Okay. But back then, that was a little bit more of an issue. And just then you get to the extremes. Like the Church of Christ didn't allow musical instruments in worship. It's all a cappella singing. And that's because they felt there's a scripture in the New Testament that mentions singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. And the argument was, well, there's no instrument mentioned there. And you can go back to the Old Testament and find David who praised God with his heart, but there was no real example of it in the New Testament. And so we didn't have musical instruments. Then you get to crazy stuff. Like we would pick elders for our church. And one of the requirements for elders is that their children remain in the faith. And I forget the exact phrase that is used, but the word children is used. And so they interpreted that to mean two or more, because children is plural. So if you only had one child and they were faithful, you couldn't be an elder because you didn't have children.
What?
I know.
Whoa.
But that's the cycle that you get into when you go down an extreme legalism with the Bible, is that you get to these silly things. And then, we were very conservative in our sect, but then there are even, you could go further down the line. There's groups that didn't have Bible class because they felt like when the church came together, they were supposed to be one body. So you didn't divide up into Bible classes, or you didn't sing songs with a chorus because you weren't singing together in unison. You can really pare it down to just crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Some people drank out of one cup instead of having other cups for communion. But it's that kind of fundamentalist. And, there was a difference because you and Katie talk a lot about the evangelical movement that you were in for a while. And then there was the charismatic movement that you were in. And I was very different than that. So while our journeys share a lot of the same emotions, coming from a strict fundamentalist background, what was important was showing up to church every time the doors are open. So Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, having your Bible lesson done so you can answer the questions when they come to you, reading the scriptures, not doing anything that looks bad. Don't be a stumbling block to anybody. That's a big one, is don't be a stumbling block. But we never talked about a personal relationship with your Savior.
Okay.
It was not very emotional at all. And so that was something missing. I mean, I think Christianity thrives a lot on that personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And that was never a phrase that would have been said in my grandfather never used that phrase. That's not what was talked about. And similarly, we missed out on some of the bad stuff that came with evangelicalism later, like the purity culture.
Okay.
So I would say that probably started up in the 90s. And that wasn't really a thing in the Church of Christ. In the Church of Christ, you don't have sex until you're married. That's it. There's no discussion about you being, a great and wonderful sacrifice to your spouse and how great, there's a lot of the emotional guilt that comes with it. It's just, oh, you had sex. Well, you're going to hell. Unless you, unless you're repented, you can, and turn from your ways. But it's very different. It just wasn't emotional like that. It's very legalistic.
Yeah. Interesting. That's interesting that, even thinking about it in that way, the super strict black and white simplicity of that belief system, how that could affect you differently than, I guess I would have considered the churches and the circles we grew up in to be really black and white as well in a lot of areas. And I think you said something about how in your sect of the Church of Christ, they said, we speak when the Bible speaks and we're silent when the Bible's silent. That idea.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I think the churches we grew up in probably said that same sentence or a similar sentence, but then the outplay of that was just a little bit different. And like you said, I think purity culture, that stuff played in a lot more for us. And there was a lot more emotion, and there was a lot more people talking about sex and talking about what's right and what's wrong and what you can do and what you can't do and how you're supposed to date and how you're not supposed to date. Yeah. It's interesting hearing that you're saying the rule is just like, no sex before marriage. That's an ironclad rule. And
right. That was it. I mean, that was just, and also you have to realize in the 80s, especially in the late 80s, AIDS had come along, and I was in Alabama. And so you put together those three things. I'm in the Bible Belt. I'm in a fundamentalist family, and everybody was scared that they were going to die if they kissed the wrong person there for a while, because in the beginning of AIDS, nobody knew what was going on.
Okay.
And so all those things combined to where, as a teenager, I'm a 16-year-old boy, all you can think about is sex, but it's the last thing you're going to do. It's just not on the table. That is not going to happen.
Yeah. Wow. It's actually funny too, something you mentioned earlier about how you said the Church of Christ, that you don't use instruments. That brought up a memory for me that I had completely forgotten about when Katie and I were looking for new churches in Wisconsin at one point. And this was like shortly after we got married and right when we were beginning to look for a church just for ourselves. We ended up going to a Church of Christ church, or going to a Church of Christ meeting one Sunday morning, because we had heard that they were like super strict on the Bible. They really believed the Bible was literal. And at that point, we're like, yeah, that's right. That's what we need to do.
Yeah.
But I specifically remember the worship time. There's a guy preaching up in the front with a little podium and a little like flexible microphone coming out of the wooden podium, and he's standing there preaching, and he's like, all right, we're going to do some singing now. Like, open up your hymnals. And so we open up the hymnals, and suddenly he just starts belting it out into the microphone on the podium. And we're like, whoa, what's going on? It caught us by surprise. And I'll never forget that now. And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I feel like that was some kind of weird, hidden, buried memory that you just brought up to the surface.
That's funny because, it was my baseline. That's just the way I knew people to sing. And so the first time I ever visited a church where there was a musical instrument, it was quite shocking. It seemed overpowering to me, because I thought, you can't even hear the voices. There's that loud organ playing and all these instruments. And the first time I heard drums, I was like, oh, well, this is ridiculous. This isn't even church.
This is way off. Yeah.
The other thing I probably ought to mention about the Church of Christ that they're known for, especially outside of the Church of Christ, like the Baptists who see them, is that generally we as in the Church of Christ, thought we were the only ones going to heaven.
Okay.
And so,
classic.
And exactly. And I remember thinking as, a young teenager, wow, how lucky I was to be born into this family that is so strong in the faith and just happens to be in the right one. And we take the Bible literally and we really follow it, and just how wonderful that is. I mean, it sounds so stupid and cringy for me to explain that now, but that's really what I thought. As a young time, I'm talking about 12, 13 years old, when your world is so small, it's fairly easy for those thoughts to root themselves. And that was the way I was. Yeah.
You had no chance to even think anything else. Everyone in your life was telling you the same thing, Of course you thought that. It bothers
me that I had zoomed out to that one point, and it bothered me enough, and I didn't have anybody to help me. But in general, you have to accept what's put in front of you, or your life becomes very difficult in a family that's so ingrained in it.
Yeah, definitely. So you had that first kind of doubt around 12 or 13, around when you were getting baptized. Then did you kind of continue on as a Christian through your teens and into your 20s? Or what did the next few years leading up to kind of those first dominoes start to fall look like?
So there was a long time till the next domino fell.
Okay.
And I think to describe that gap, I kind of have to fill in what happened in my life and how I accepted Christianity. You and Katie really embraced it and wanted to spread the good news to other people, and loved the whole idea of Christianity and heaven. And it wasn't that way for me. I would describe it as I accepted that it was true. And I certainly accepted that there was an eternal hell. And I accepted that I was probably going to be saved from that. But also in the Church of Christ, you can fall away and then get grafted back in and fall away again. It's not once saved, always saved kind of thing. You can fall away. And so if you do a few bad things, or in a child's mind, if you say a cuss word on your way out the door as you're leaving this life, you're in hell because you left this life with a sin and didn't pray for forgiveness. And so generally my attitude was one of acceptance. And, I had times, and I'll go over those, but I had times when I was more into it than others and when it seemed more real and more emotional to me. But I would say what happened is that I always kept church attendance and faith a bit on the back burner. It was never always my first thought. But, I went to college for 2 years at a place called Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas, in rural Arkansas. And it's a Church of Christ school. There are a number of Church of Christ schools in the country. And the reason I went there is because my grandparents, my granddad, who I listened to preach, and my grandmother, I was their only grandson. They also had a granddaughter, but they had saved up some money, and education was important to them. And so was God. And they told me that they would pay my tuition to a Christian school if I would choose to go to a Church of Christ school. Well, I wasn't a straight A student, and I didn't earn scholarships anywhere. And so I said yes. And I wasn't thinking about things real hard back then. I kind of accepted that this was my life. And so I went to Harding University for 2 years. And that's where my parents had met in the 1960s, I believe. And that's even where my grandparents, who sent me there, had met in the 1930s. So I had a rich, deep heritage.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right. And I can't say that I was excited about going there, but I accepted it. And hey, I was getting my tuition paid and My
Yeah,
parents
right.
were going to pay for some living expenses, and they worked real hard to do that for me. So I was going to take it. So I
Yeah.
did. And boy, just as soon as I got there, within a month or two, I knew that I hated it. I absolutely hated the school. The school was pretty, they had dress codes about how long your hair could be and how long your shorts had to be. And you had to be in at 11 o'clock, and they'd come check in your dorm room to make sure you were in by
Wow.
curfew, and they would penalize you if you weren't. We had chapel every weekday, and they would come check your assigned seat at chapel and make sure that you were there. And if you weren't, if you missed 10 chapels in a semester, you would get punished by having a 5 p.m. curfew on weekends or something like that. I can't remember all the rules, but It was real heavy.
Yeah.
And even though I had grown up in a conservative family, I didn't really have rules at home about how late I could stay out or what I could do. I think mainly because I was a nerd and I didn't get into trouble, and my parents trusted me.
So you didn't
I had traveled around doing some sports and stayed in hotels by myself, and I'd had plenty of opportunity to get in all the trouble I'd wanted and really never had. And then I go to this college that was treating me like I was going to cause trouble. And so I took offense at that. I was upset that this college felt like they needed to put rules on me. But, I went there, and I should have known everything before I got there, but I wasn't really paying attention. But so that was kind of my first move away from home. And then after that, I went to Georgia Tech. I transferred there for engineering. I told my grandparents, hey, I got to study engineering, and they don't have a program here, which was true. And then fortunately, they supported my education onto Georgia Tech. And so I'm really appreciative to them for that. They did a great thing. And I ended up getting a degree in chemical engineering. And, I would go to church for the most part while I was in college, but Georgia Tech wasn't exactly a party school. It's strictly an engineering technology school. And so it wasn't real hard for me to just stay calm and focus on studies and get through. And at that point, I was out working as an engineer again in Arkansas. And I just kept going to church. I joined a little church when I moved to my job at a paper mill and taught a class to fourth graders or fifth graders. And I generally do pretty well talking to, the fourth to sixth grade boys. They kind of, they take me as being real, and I listen to them. And so I remember teaching the class, and I enjoyed it. And, you're able to ask them interesting questions, and they'll actually think about the answers. Yeah. And at that point, I got married that time. 1 year after I got out of college, I got married to a girl I'd met at Harding University, who was also very strongly Church of Christ. Her dad had been a preacher in the Church of Christ. She had grandparents that were in the Church of Christ. Her vertical and horizontal family was also a Church of Christ. And if you want me to go into that a little bit, I can, because that's a pretty important part of my background.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
When you're in college, obviously marriage is on your mind. If you're a 20-something-year-old boy and you're a virgin, and you don't want to remain this way your whole life, and everybody's getting married up. I mean, I can't say that I was enthusiastic. I wasn't really looking for a wife, but I mean, that's kind of what has to happen.
Yeah.
I had a girlfriend that wasn't in the Church of Christ. She was Lutheran, not Lutheran like Katie was, but they went on Sunday sometime. And that was a real relationship I had with her, and it was on again, off again for a while over the period of about 2 years. And eventually I ended that relationship in what I would say was premature, and not because that should have been the person that I was with. That relationship was going to end. But what was really important in the Church of Christ was to not be unequally yoked to a non-believer. I don't know if you're familiar with that passage.
Yeah.
All my life, I had heard how important it is to marry another person in the church, church. That's the phrase they would use. And by that, they mean the Church of Christ. Okay. Because that's the only church, because we're the only ones going to heaven.
Oh, right. That's right. Right. Okay. So it's a very narrow, you have a very narrow selection of who you can choose
from. It's tiny. Yeah, exactly. I had a tiny, narrow selection. Yeah. And the woman I ended up marrying basically checked the boxes for me. Mm-hmm. And one of the boxes was that I could get along with her. I mean, she was intelligent and we could have conversations.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. And I had not met another person in the church that I knew that I even wanted to really spend time around. And so I ended the relationship that I was in, kind of restarted the relationship with the woman from Harding, and we ended up getting married 1 year after I graduated, when she finished grad school. And, the things I look back on my life and think about what I did differently because I was a Christian and the influences it had on me, I ended the relationship with my girlfriend at that time too early. And I think it stunted my emotional growth, because when you're in your early 20s and you're learning how to navigate the world of relationships and love, there need to be a few relationships that you see through from beginning to end. I believe that you see the ups and downs, and you understand the general flow of a relationship. And I cut that short. I didn't see the end of that relationship, because I knew that I needed to marry within the church. And I remember thinking that I couldn't be the strong one also. Like I'd explained, I never had faith at the forefront of my mind, but I accepted it. And I knew I needed somebody strong in the faith to help me stay strong also. And so I chose to have a relationship with a woman that I knew would do that for me. And we ended up getting married. And we stayed married a long time, and we were married 22 years.
Wow.
So, it was a long time. And what happened in that, so there was you asked when the next domino fell, which I'm getting around to. I'm rambling for long periods of time. The next domino really didn't fall for me until sometime in the mid 2000s, I would say. So you can bump all the way from, the mid 90s to the mid 2000s, without really much of a change. And the reason that is because life got busy for me. I decided that I wanted to go to medical school. So that involved a lot of classes in addition to my full-time engineering job. And then, you have to take a test, and you have to volunteer, and then you get in, and then you've got 4 years of medical school, and that just eats up every bit of time and effort you have. And then I did 4 years of residency, and that eats up all your time and effort too. So for a decade, I was kind of pursuing my education and career while my wife she worked while I was in medical school, but not after that. She didn't work during residency or any time after that. She worked and made some friends, but, made a lot of church friends, honestly, in several places that we lived. Whereas the people that were at the church where I went, obviously with her, they weren't really so much my friends as they were just acquaintances that happened to go to church. My real friends were at work. And so we kind of, the way people grow apart over decades, well, that's a big part of it, is that we were just living in different worlds for that long period of time. So not to stretch that time out too far, but basically the next domino that fell, and I assume you want to move on to that, was probably, 2007 or 8. And I was at work, and I was talking to one of the nurses, and, you have some downtime at the hospital, so you just talk about whatever's on your mind sometime. And I made this comment, and I said, and I don't know what part of the discussion led up to it, but I said, I can't imagine one of my sons growing up to be gay. That would be one of the worst things I can imagine. I mean, that's what I just said that out loud to her, not thinking anything of it. And right now I cringe. I mean, that's horrible to think back to what I said. And she was probably 5 years younger than me. I thought of her as younger than me anyway. And to her credit, she just called me out right there. She said, I can't believe you just said that. I thought you were a nice person. And it really made me check up, because I didn't think of that as being a horrible thing to say. I didn't hate gay people. I didn't consider myself homophobic. I meant it more in a way that would be a horrible struggle for them to go through. And then I also meant it in a way that I would have to deal with it, and my family and my church and it's a problem. I didn't mean it in a hateful way, but it certainly sounded hateful. And then I came to realize that it was hateful eventually. But it took me, I don't know, 2 to 4 months for that to really sink in, because sometimes I can be rude and sometimes I can be overly confident, but I'm not hateful. And for me to come across as that to somebody and to realize that I sounded that way really hit me hard. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Wow. So that one conversation specifically, you're saying that you thought about that conversation for a long time. It really struck you. About
that conversation and about whether it was right for me to feel that way. I mean, at that time I had two sons, and they were probably, 7 and 4 years old at the time. Obviously this hadn't become an issue, but you always wonder what your kids are going to grow up to be, and you look for signs of how they are.
Mm-hmm.
And, you think about, are they going to grow up to be good at math or good at science or good at English? Are they going to be good readers and writers? Are they going to be faithful or not? Are they going to be gay or straight? All these things you think about.
Mm-hmm.
But and it was almost not even a conversation. It was just a statement. And then she called me out on it and we moved on. And I've never been able to thank her for that. I wish I could see her again to tell her.
I was going to ask that if you're ever able to tell her.
I mean, I think I didn't realize the significance that it played at that time. I mean, I knew it was significant, but I didn't realize that I would look back 20 years from now
right,
and think, wow, that really changed me. I didn't know. A lot of times those moments happen. We don't know it at the time. But eventually I had reached the point in my mind where I had resolved that I didn't care if either one or both of my sons were gay at all, that I would not reject them or make them uncomfortable in any way for being that way. And that if they were gay, that I would want them to be gay, to come out and to be exactly who they are.
Yeah.
And, I say it's a domino that fell. It's almost not really a domino that fell. It was the first time that I willfully decided that I was going to be something completely different than what I knew the Bible really called for.
Wow.
Because the Bible would not call for me to just willingly accept that person into my home the way that I wanted to. And so after I got to that conclusion strongly enough, my wife and I were talking at one point and I told her, and I can almost remember exactly how I told her. I said, I've been thinking about it. And if one of our sons turns out to be gay, I want him to bring his boyfriend over to our house on Thanksgiving and a Christmas holiday. And I'm going to invite him in and I'm going to hug him like he's a daughter-in-law. And I'm going to love him. And I want him to sit at our table right beside us and eat with us and be part of the family, because I'm not going to reject either of my sons for being gay.
Yeah.
I straight out came out and said, I think I needed to say it. I needed to make the declaration to myself.
Yeah. To solidify it or something.
Yeah. It's one thing to believe something within, but it's another thing to say it to somebody else, especially somebody that can take it for the declaration that it is, because we had the same views on pretty much everything.
Definitely.
And she said, and to her, she hadn't been through the emotional journey I had the 3 or 4 months before that. She said, I don't think I could do that. Now, she didn't say what specifically she couldn't do or what she wouldn't do. But she just simply said that. And then we moved on. We didn't discuss it anymore. And she never went back and addressed it. She never corrected it.
Wow.
And I don't know what her feelings would be on it now. I mean, she's still faithful in the Church of Christ, but, I don't know that was a domino that fell that made me believe the Bible was wrong, but it was a line I drew in the sand that said, I'm not willing to reject my son for something like that.
Yeah.
The Bible. So that was big to me.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm curious, how did you go from that initial comment from your coworker to 3 or 4 months later, you had kind of softened? And like you said, it was maybe one of the first times that you had allowed yourself to believe something that went against what you thought the Bible was saying. Right.
Yeah.
What were those emotional months like? I mean, what did that process look like?
I think, all my life, I've not really declared that I knew for sure that God was real and knew for sure that there was a hell in heaven. I accepted it. And there are some people that can make an argument from a biblical standpoint that was cultural or that the passages didn't mean what they mean, that homosexuality is an abomination. And I realized that the people in front of me, my 2 sons in front of me, were worth more than anything that might or might not be true. And that I wasn't willing to reject them for anything. And just when you get down to a base level of what feels right and wrong, somehow rejecting a person for wanting to experience love, just didn't feel right at all. And I think in a way too, I had been exposed to gay people, because I had gone from growing up in the Church of Christ in the South, to where I would have never been exposed to a gay person, or hear rumors of somebody, or you make fun of somebody because maybe you think they might be, to working in the healthcare field where there's plenty of gay people around. Even, in Alabama in the 2000s, I worked with people that were knowingly gay. And being around people, you realize, wait a minute, these people aren't evil. They're not out to destroy things. They're not Satan worshipers. They're not, just me being with them or talking to them or sitting beside them doesn't ruin me. There's nothing about it that hurts. So it wasn't just all within. It was also being exposed to that and really seeing it for what it is, which is just normal people wanting to live and love and have relationships.
Yeah.
And I think also it's very important to me, a sense of fairness is, because we all have different priorities in our ethical world. And fairness was always important to me, to the point where, and this is kind of a quirky thing about my background. When I was at Georgia Tech, I took a class called History of the New South. And in that class, it was just a required class. We had to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Well, I had grown up in a town that was probably 70% white, 30% black, and gone to schools that were integrated and seen a lot of racial tension growing up. But I never really stopped to think about why or what circumstances led to the situations that I saw. I mean, I saw that generally black people were poorer and less well off than the white people that I was around. And of course, most people around me seemed to attribute that to some kind of racial stereotypical differences, but that didn't really make sense to me. Yeah. And then when I was in college, I was exposed to the story of Malcolm X, and it really sparked my interest in history. I'd never been interested in any kind of history before, but a history that finally explained things around me, explained why things were the way they were, or at least gave a view. Really, I felt enlightened. And at that point, I took a few more African-American history classes. And then I ended up finishing, even though I majored in chemical engineering, I had a minor in African-American history. And so even back then, when I wasn't, thinking about the religious issues, the sense of fairness or what's right was still in me. Okay. And I credit to some degree my parents for raising me up that way. They didn't raise me in a racist way. They didn't raise me with hate. They raised me in a fundamentalist church, but it was a loving type of environment that I was raised in. Yeah. And so I think that sense of fairness also helped me make the decision that, hey, this is wrong, that I would think this way about it.
Yeah. Wow. That is really interesting. I love that. I mean, it sounds really similar, actually, like you were mentioning earlier, kind of a zooming out, even when you're in your small social circles, your small environment in your hometown, and you zoom out and you start to learn the history of African Americans, and it gives you a so much broader context of why things are the way they are and who people are and why we have these feelings we have, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Yes. I really, really like the story so far.
I can give a very specific example, and you can edit this out if you want, but I find it interesting. When I was, 13 years old, 14 years old, I used to ride my bike about 6 miles to this recreational area in the city that had a swimming pool and tennis courts and all that. And of course, I would ride through all kinds of different neighborhoods, from my middle-class white neighborhood to the park. And some of them were bad neighborhoods, and some of them were housing developments. And I didn't even realize at the time that they were public housing developments. They were more duplexes. These weren't high rises. They're just duplexes jammed close together. And when I'm riding my bike, you're particularly exposed to the surroundings when you're riding your bike through a place. And I had figured out the route to take so that I felt the safest, which I realized happened to be also the route that put me through the housing developments that had the white people in them. So I naturally chose to ride my bike as a white teenager through the white housing developments instead of the African-American housing developments or black housing developments. And I didn't realize, I'm just a stupid kid at that time. I didn't realize, this is a relic of segregation and housing development, how they didn't house them together. They separated them. And I just knew, all right, to get to the park safely, I don't need to turn there. I need to turn here. And, if you're a white guy, you probably are a little safer in your white neighborhood when you're 12 years old than riding through a black neighborhood. And so, being in college and then realizing, oh my goodness, segregation wasn't long ago. It was just a few years ago, because in the 80s, it was just a few years ago that the schools were segregated. I went to a magnet school that was partially the purpose in elementary school was to integrate the schools in my city. And so I saw a lot of immediate effects from it that nobody explained to me until I got to college and learned it. So That's why I was so interested in it. And that's the part you can edit out if you want.
Cool, man. That is really interesting and really insightful. And I feel like it speaks to your attitude towards life and being always curious and trying to figure things out. Just like you said, it all fits together.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's a bit of revisionist history too, because I think the histories we retain in our own minds are dynamic.
Of course,
it's not like I can recount every single event. I'm sure how I described my faith 25 years ago. It's hard to recover those emotions.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, however they live in your mind now, that's how they live in your mind now. So it almost doesn't matter what actually happened in the past. Like
that's true.
You have the history you're living with. It's there to stay. All right. So we got up to the point, the first domino kind of fell with that conversation with your coworker, or it began to fall. What happened after that point? You told your wife, and then kind of where did things go from there?
Well, so that was, and we didn't pursue anything at that point as far as the discussion of faith. And I hadn't lost my faith or wasn't rejecting at that point. But then probably 6-7 years later, it was probably 2013, 14. We had actually gone outside of the Church of Christ a few times to non-denominational churches in the different places that we had lived. And so we had experienced some of the evangelical influences. Now, the churches that we went to were more of a Church of Christ flavor, like they may still have baptism by emergence and some other basic principles of the Church of Christ, but also they were singing the newer songs that were coming out, the contemporary Christian songs, and they would have a worship group singing, or then they would have a guitar, or they would have a whole band, and people would raise their hands and clap, and you would talk about your personal relationship or accepting Jesus Christ or your walk with the Lord. All those phrases start to come into existence. And so while I didn't experience it to the full degree that you did, I got a taste of it.
Okay.
And when we moved to the city where we are now in Huntsville, it was probably 2013, give or take a year. There's a large Church of Christ very close to where we moved, and functional youth group, lots of people go there in the community. And we had decided, what, it's time to get back to our roots. I think we had always studied the scriptures really hard in services in the Church of Christ. Like, you took your Bible to church. You did not go to church without your Bible.
Yeah.
You carried your Bible. You get in trouble if you were a kid and you didn't have your Bible.
Sure.
And so you go to your Bible, you read, you study. Every sermon has 5, 6, 7, 10 scriptures. Your class is probably a chapter study in a book, and maybe you're working your way through one book of the New Testament where you cover a chapter every week. And then in the non-denominational churches, it was much more touchy-feely. Sometimes you'd have to hold hands with people, which I never enjoyed doing. You'd have to go forward and pray on them, and you'd put your hands on other people. And I think both of us, since we had our roots in the fundamentalism, wanted to get back there a little bit, and wanted our children maybe to see what it really meant to study the scriptures and follow them. And so we agreed together to go back to a traditional Church of Christ. And I think that was the beginning of the end for me, because I started getting very frustrated in sermons or lessons because things would get said that I didn't agree with.
Okay.
And seemingly everybody else agreed. It was just little stuff here and there. But then the next turning, if you want to know the real domino that fell, and this was the switch that kicked on for me. And this, just as an aside, I've listened to a bunch of deconstruction and deconversion stories. I mean, a lot of them, and not in person, all on podcasts. And I love to hear the stories because I like to see what got people to wake up and leave.
Yeah.
And it's funny because for a lot of people, the trigger is not something that works for anybody else. And so I'm going to explain what happened to me, and it won't seem significant to anybody else, but to me, it was surely significant. And there was one other, I think of so many things I wanted to say that I didn't get to tell you. I didn't have a background that was abusive. I don't have a horrible story about why I had to get out.
Yeah.
And I think that's one reason I like listening to you and Katie so much, because a lot of the deconversion stories I've listened to are just amazing, that they survived and that they got out, and how strong these people are to deal with what they went through.
Right.
And mine wasn't like that at all. Mine was more of a logical person stuck in an illogical environment at times that just felt like he was probably going to hell a lot of times and
Okay.
really suffered the mild consequences over a long period of time that come with that.
Yeah.
And so for some reason, I had decided that I needed to sort out in my mind what was going to happen to a person like a suicidal, extreme Islamic terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
Because that example always bothered me. And as soon back when 9/11 hit and then there were other bombings, people would discuss it like, oh, it was such a cowardly act done by these cowardly people. And, you know, they would just belittle them. And that never made sense to me. I
Yeah.
always thought, well, no, that was very brave of them to do that. They had a
Right.
lot of courage. They flew themselves into a building and killed themselves. It was for a terrible reason and it did a terrible thing, but you can't really call them cowardly. And so in my mind, especially knowing that some of these people, you know, grew up in madrasas, is that right? You know, the schools where they just really don't study anything else other than the Quran and they memorize everything and they're really indoctrinated. And I love that word indoctrinated. They're indoctrinated from a young age in a much, much stronger way than I was. And so you take a person like that and you point them in the right direction with the right motivation and they do something like, you know, a suicide bombing where they kill some innocent people with the idea that they're doing the most noble thing they can do.
Yeah.
And so to me, that person has a clean conscience for serving God.
Yeah. Yeah.
The absolute best thing he knew to do. And maybe he thought he was saving his family in the process, gaining some eternal life for it. I don't know exactly what their thought process was because I've not studied Islam in depth at all, but I had trouble reasoning out what was going to happen to that person.
Yeah.
Well, in the Church of Christ, or at least in my version and in the people I had talked to, sometimes the discussion comes up, what happens to the people that haven't been exposed to Jesus and the story and the Bible? How are they going to be judged? What is their future going to hold for them? And I guess some Christians think, well, if they didn't hear about Jesus, they're going to go to hell. Which seems kind of unreasonable if you didn't even have a chance.
That is pretty unreasonable.
Yeah. So there was a scripture, and I don't know exactly where it is. I actually made a list of scriptures, but I won't go to reading for you. But there was one about, I think actually Romans 2, verses 14 through 16, about how the conscience will basically be the guide for people that don't know Jesus. And it will even be a testimony for them. And so in my mind, if people live with a clean conscience, doing what they thought was morally and ethically right, treating people around them the way that the best they knew how, then they would be judged accordingly by a fair God and enter heaven or hell, whichever one is appropriate. But it didn't make sense that this bomber, this, you know, hypothetical bomber could do that because I don't want to be arm in arm with this guy that just killed a bunch of innocent people.
Right.
Because he was doing the right thing. I couldn't get to that point. I couldn't accept it.
Yeah.
So what I eventually decided was that killing a person that is not an immediate threat to you or to someone with you is obviously wrong, whether you want to call it a sin or whatever you want to call it. That's a transgression. That is obviously wrong. And that anybody that uses any kind of common sense should be able to figure out. And so I reasoned that bomber was not going to go to heaven, not be judged righteous by God because he had gone against what was so clearly wrong.
Yeah.
And the way I stated it in my mind is that guy had to use common sense. His burden was to use common sense to figure out that was wrong, even if people told him it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And I landed on that conclusion pretty hard after I thought about it. And then one day, probably several days after I landed on that conclusion, it dawned on me, I'm holding him responsible for using common sense. Oh my God. I think we all have to use common sense. And I mean, literally, it just hit me like a ton of bricks one day. We all have to use common sense. I mean, it just washed over me.
Yeah.
Quickly.
Wow.
I'm not using common sense. And, you know, since I had my science background, there were tons of apologetics And I had the most cognitive dissonance of just about anybody you could find in that kind of environment.
Uh-huh.
And it always bothered me that I had to just sweep that all under the rug with whatever, apologetic I could come up with at the time.
Right.
God knows, God can do it any way he wants. Sure, the creation story doesn't make sense, but he couldn't explain his ways to us. So I remember thinking, okay, common sense, here we go. I'm going to use common sense. And I decided whatever comes up is a problem. And when you're going to a fundamentalist church 3 times a week, there are many problems that pop up on a regular basis.
I'm sure.
I had decided, I said, you know what? I'm not going to whack-a-mole anymore. When a problem pops up, when something pops up that doesn't seem right or doesn't seem common sense, doesn't seem legitimate or just seems wrong, I'm going to let it sit there. And I'm going to let it be wrong. I'm not going to push it back under. I'm going to let it sit. And I said, I'm just going to make a pile of this stuff. In my mind, I'd made a pile to the side of all the stuff that's wrong. And it doesn't take long till that pile starts really mounting up. And then it becomes, 2 years worth and you got 50 things in the pile. Whether homosexuality or the role of women or the genocidal nature of God or the eternal punishment of hell being so out of proportion to anything we do and just cruel and unjust on every level. And then the Old Testament stories and animals are talking. And then one day you read Revelation and it's just this whole pile of stuff that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so that was the switch that flipped that let me start keeping track of the problems.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
So it was that kind of the elevation of common sense above like, adherence to a religious book or a religious belief that you kind of came to terms with in your mind. And then you applied that to yourself. And because you applied that to yourself, it basically forced you to deconstruct everything that you were hearing at church every week. It
did. And when I realized that, I can look back at that moment and I didn't even know the phrase cognitive dissonance at the time. Because I let those problems build up for a couple of years before I went really reading and searching. Okay. But I remember the day I saw that phrase. I'm like, oh my God, that's my phrase. That's what I have. That's me.
That's what I have.
Yeah. I mean, it was, my whole mind was full of, and then you learn about straw manning and, oh my God, that's what they're doing with science at church. That's why I get mad when they talk about anything. Straw manning. I just didn't know how to say that. And so I just got opened up to so much. But interestingly enough, I've heard you and Katie talk about doubting a lot too in some of your podcasts and the different nature of doubt. And I've tried to figure this out for myself too. I had doubts all through my life at various times, and I would talk to people about them. I guess because I was curious of how they dealt with them. I think there's a mindset of doubting where you think, oh, I've got a problem with that. I wonder how other people deal with that. Hey, how do you deal with this problem? Okay, what do you deal with this problem? And then you kind of take what you can from those people and think, all right, well, this is how I'm going to deal with this problem. And you come up with your own apologetic that means something to you. And then you move on because you don't want it to destroy your whole faith or bring everything down. You just want to know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
But then I remember when that switch flipped and I was at a point in my life where I did not have a desire to believe it anymore. I remember when I got to start using common sense, I got excited about it because I thought, this may not be true. This may not be true. Hell may not be real. I got to figure this out. And there was a desire. I think I wanted to know the real truth. And if that meant it wasn't real, I really wanted to know that. I didn't want anybody to tell me how they got around it and how I could too. And so I internalized it 100%. I didn't talk to anybody about it. Not my wife, not my friends, not people at church, not leaders at the church, not anybody.
Yeah. And were you wanting to kind of figure that out for yourself before you brought that up with anyone else close to you?
Well, when I started down that road, it wasn't my plan you don't start down the road going, all right, I'm going to deconvert myself here.
Right. Yeah, definitely not.
It's not. You just start down the road like, man, I'm going to really figure this out.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the biggest thing for me was hell, I think, and overcoming the idea that hell is real and it's just waiting for me as a default.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I'm past that fear now. It doesn't really haunt me any now, but for a long time, I felt like it did, and it would come and go. And to work my way to the point where I could convince myself that there really wasn't a hell. I say convince myself. I mean, you are convincing early in the early stages,
Right.
To even open your mind up to the possibility that it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
And now it just seems silly that it would be real to me. But in those early stages, it's a struggle. But yeah, I managed to get myself there just completely on my own. And then eventually there's enough asking questions where you go, all right, I got to read about this. And since I'm scientific, I wanted to read about evolution because in my mind, I'd always had some problems with the gaps of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't understand how we got from monkeys to humans. That was a hard thing for me to grasp. Mm-hmm. Also hard for me to grasp how life ever came from non-life, which is still difficult for me to imagine.
I mean, that's a pretty significant question. I think that's a hard question for anyone to grasp.
Biogenesis and stuff. It's not something we can ever know. I mean, there's theories, and we're still trying to learn as much as we can about that. And I'm not an expert on it, but because of my scientific background and what I felt the first interest in, I found Dawkins first. So I read some Richard Dawkins.
Yeah. Went in with the heavy hitters right off the bat.
I didn't know it was a heavy hitter. I probably just did something like Googled, and whatever. And that pops up. But by that time I was ready to be a non-believer. I just needed to know what was true and what wasn't. So I wanted to get something beyond the Christian influences that I'd always had.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you were ready for it at that point.
I was
going to say when I first started doubting my faith and wanted to kind of read the world's, in quotes, the world's perspective on creation and evolution and all this stuff, I tried reading some Richard Dawkins, and I was like, this guy, he's so mad and he's so mean and he's so bitter. I don't want anything to do with him. I wasn't ready for him yet.
That's funny because I read him and it just instantly landed with me. Like everything he was saying, I'm like, oh my God, this is so good. He talked us through. This is amazing.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed Dawkins.
Okay. This sense of relief for you.
Yeah.
So you started reading some books, started kind of looking outside of yourself, outside of the Christian circles. What brought you to the point to where you could actually say, I don't believe anymore, or I'm not a Christian anymore?
Yeah. So now we're going to tie into my personal life some, So I had been married for 22 years, and we had grown apart over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. And then I had just spent 4 years going through this relatively long, serious deconversion process without saying a word to her about it, because that's not really something you can discuss. I mean, I could have discussed doubts, but I couldn't have ever said, hey, I'm going to try not going to church for a while, Right. And so I had become a different person, and our marriage was already struggling for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons that I won't talk about too much in detail, but I'll just affirm what you and Katie have talked about, is that, we were both, I was 23, she was 24 when we got married. We were both virgins. Mm-hmm. And when two people that have been scared off sex their whole life get married and they're virgins in their mid early 20s, that is not a good thing. That does not work well.
Right.
And so we had the typical struggles, and then some that go along with growing up in a fundamentalist Christian environment and then trying to figure it out later. And we had a physically intimate life, but it never was what it should have been without that influence. And I still blame Christianity for a lot of that. And I'm sure some of it had to do with the fact that I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, there I was, a young, ignorant, guy trying my best, but I'm sure I wasn't doing a good job. But there were a lot of factors in my personal relationship that weren't good in our marriage. And I had come to the point where I didn't really want to be married anymore because I knew, and my wife was she's very adherent and very much a strong believer, which is what I wanted when I married her. And so I got what I wanted. But then when I was ready to be done with it, there was no way she was ever going to be done with it. And beyond that, I've heard you and Katie talk about this before, and I can go on a diversion about this. In the Church of Christ, the phrase divorce is not an option. Mm-hmm. Very common. When you get married, divorce is not an option. Yeah. And I heard sermons over and over again about how people in the world approach marriage, and they just figure if it's not going to work, they get divorced. But we know divorce is not an option. And then just how much of a prison that can make a marriage.
Yeah. Right.
Because you think that's a good thing when you're entering it. Good. This person knows we're not getting divorced.
Yeah.
I know we're not getting divorced. Great. We're not getting divorced.
Yeah.
But pretty soon that can become, okay, I'm stuck with this. All right. I got to make the best of it. And, I guess the mature way would be, well, let's go to counseling and figure this out. Let's really work on it and make it the absolute best marriage we can. But, I probably wasn't pretty mature, and I just figured, all right, well, I'm going to do what I can to make this work, and I'm going to try to keep her happy, and I'm going to try to find enjoyment myself. Mm-hmm. So you end up creating almost a facade of a relationship.
Yeah.
Because you're stuck.
Right.
You're stuck. And that's where we were at the time. I knew I was stuck for a long time. Well, and this is where I kind of set off a nuclear bomb in my life. This was the moment that my internal struggles led to something happening in the real world. Uh-huh. My wife had asked to spend some time with me that night. One night, it was the afternoon. And I said, well, I don't want to. And I think we need to get counseling because, we're having trouble. And she may have sensed it some already. Mm-hmm. I'm sure she did, but she was probably in denial about some of it. And I'm sure that hit her just like a ton of bricks. And I feel bad that I did that, but I didn't know how else to do it. And I didn't know where I was at the time. Yeah. I thought I didn't want to stay married, but I didn't know that for sure. And then my next statement right after that was, and also, let's not get a Christian counselor because I don't believe in God.
Oh my gosh.
So, so I kind of blew up everything.
Yeah, that's a big one.
I mean, I can, you laugh and I can kind of laugh, but it's really, it was in a sense a horrible thing to do.
I'm sure.
I feel really guilty about having to do that, but I don't know. Man, that's a tough thing to deal with. I don't know how I could have handled it better. I'm sure I could have some way, but I basically, dropped 2 nuclear bombs at the same time.
Yeah.
And so that's how it became out. That's how I came out. Okay. And even then, we agreed that I would still keep going to church. My boys were going to church. That was our life at the time. All her friends go to church. And said, I'm going to keep going to church. I'm not going to stop going. Mm-hmm. And so I kept going for a few months, probably 2 or 3 months after that. And then she actually told me, it's like, I need you to stop going to church. I need you to tell our boys that you don't believe anymore. I need you to tell your parents, this isn't working. And I know to some degree why, because maybe I think I heard in maybe your most recent interview with Andy and Jeremy, they talked about when you are sitting through something like church with somebody else, that you hear it through them to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved how she said that.
Me being there ruined church for her. Completely.
Right.
I bet.
Yeah.
She heard every problem. And it's like taking your mom to a rated R movie. You start watching the rated R movie through your mom's eyes.
Yeah. Right.
What to do, It ruins it.
It ruins a movie. So,
yeah. I'm sure that I ruined church for her at that point. Okay. So then I told my my kids and my parents, which was tough. And those are really the only people I told personally. Everybody else just heard it.
Okay. And was that process of you kind of telling your family and your kids and your parents, was that really difficult for you to do, or was it a sense of relief? Was it a mix of both?
It was a mix of both. I had grown to really hate what I saw being said in front of my 2 sons at church. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so in a way, I was very excited to tell them. Okay. But I knew that it was emotionally, it was going to be tough on them. And one of my kids is very sensitive, more so than the other. And I really hurt for him and how I knew he would take this, because I knew it was going to be hard on him. And so I hated to tell them, but at the same time, I was excited to tell them because I wanted to wash my hands of it as quickly as possible, basically.
Sure.
And I'd already essentially raised my voice. They were 15 and 12 or 13 at the time when I told them. And so they had already heard too much formative stuff for me to just take it all back. I couldn't. And they still, go to youth group activities and church with their mom and church at college. So they're still in it, but we have discussions and they've at least heard an alternative point of view.
Yeah.
As far as my parents go, that was a more difficult part for me, for sure. I told my dad first, and we had a short discussion about it, probably 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the paths of the discussion we went down. I basically said, when I'm at the hospital and I'm working on patients, prayer doesn't do me any good. This is not what fixes things. It doesn't help. There's nobody listening. This God does not care what's going on down here. When I'm taking care of a 3-year-old with leukemia and we're putting him to sleep so that he can get chemotherapy into his spinal canal, and it's the 10th time he's had it done, there's not a God up there that can justify doing this. If he's an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, this is not the result. And so I think he saw that. I think the way he phrased it was that my job posed, because I work in a hospital, I'm an anesthesiologist, because I saw sick people at my job and a lot of bad things, that it was particularly a challenge for me to believe. So he didn't say stumbling block, but I think he feels like
that's
my job makes it difficult for me to believe. And I think he's got a little bit of sympathy in that. But I asked him, I said, why do you pray? And he said, I don't know, because we're told to. And that was, I kind of went out of order, but his view and the view that I'd adopted was that God basically had put things in motion, and he had intervened at times, in critical junctures in the Old Testament, and Jesus's time and the apostles had intervened in the laws of nature. But now we're just down here on earth doing the best we can. The world is spinning. God's got his hands off of it, and things are happening. And one day it's all going to end. And I think that was his view. But I think I pointed this out to him too, because I thought this would land with him, and I don't know that it did. There's a scripture that I heard growing up quite a bit. For him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And I don't know where in the New Testament that is, maybe James or something. But once you start holding your God to the same standard that a person is held to, then it just falls apart. I mean, why can't we say, if a God knows to do good and does it not, he's a bad God?
Yeah. That's a good question.
And to put it crudely, I always say, I don't know if there's a God or not, but if there is, he's up there and he does not give a shit about what's going on down here.
Right.
And that's what I would say after I got, in a position where I had to take care of some poor kid that was just truly a victim of bad circumstances and had nobody. There's no God reaching down and taking care of that kid. And that really bothered me for a while. Yeah,
man. Well, I just want to acknowledge that was a really captivating story, first of all. And you're really good at telling your story. I'm just here listening. I'm like, it's like I'm watching a movie or something. So I really appreciate how well you're telling your story, for one, but also I just really appreciate how vulnerable you've been, and appreciate that you've been willing to share, about your personal life and your marriage and your kids and all of that. It means a lot. And I feel touched by your story, and I'm really, really glad that you were willing to come on and share all that with me. I did want to keep asking a few more questions.
Yeah, great.
And kind of maybe fast forwarding a bit to kind of where we're at now.
Okay.
I really liked something that you wrote in your form submission on the website. You wrote, I am free now, but I'm still bitter. But part of the struggle is figuring out who or what to be bitter at. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that sentiment.
Sure. It's an interesting roller coaster of emotions being an ex-Christian, isn't it?
Yeah.
I feel free to make my own moral judgments that are in the best way I can imagine possible. I can choose to accept a homosexual person 100% completely as they are, and a trans person, and whatever. I love the fact that I can make my own moral judgments and feel completely good about them.
That's a good feeling.
I feel very free in that sense. And, then there's other smaller stuff. Like I feel free to say fuck all I want. I don't have to worry that I said that word. Now, I'm respectful in that I don't say it in front of other people because I know it falls on their ears harshly and it doesn't do me any favors to say that in front of them.
Yeah.
But I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about some show that I watch on TV. Like my mom was all worried that I was watching Three's Company when I was growing up, or One Day at a Time, which were sitcoms that were popular.
Right.
I mean, I don't have to worry about these little things, these little impurities that get in our lives. I can be a moral person and watch a show with a cuss word. I can say a cuss word. I can masturbate. I can do all those things without worrying that I'm going to end up in hell because I did that.
Yeah.
So freedom to do the little things that don't matter. And then there's a freedom to judge things that, I considered a crime when I was a believer that I see don't have a victim. There's no victim to homosexuality. That's just a person being a person. And I'm free to think that. And so I really like that. And also I would say I'm free to be a good person, which sounds kind of weird, but what I mean by that, and I discovered this just completely unwittingly. I didn't know this was going to happen. After you deconvert, you don't understand what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I found myself having more sympathy for other people. And it dawned on me at some point, like, wow, David, I think you may be a good person. Because before I'd always had some sympathy for people, but also I was taught what a free moral agent was from the time I was 6 or 7 years old and how we were responsible for our own decisions. And so I saw the world from a perspective of a person that made the right decisions. And if somebody was in a bad situation, they must have made the wrong decision.
Sure.
It's a harsh way to view the world.
Yeah, no kidding.
And then you're commanded to have sympathy for them. Like, okay, I'll have some sympathy for you and I'll help you, but it's because you made the wrong decisions.
Yeah. But it's still your fault.
Right.
Come on.
But now I can just look at people and go, wow, they really need help. They're in a bad spot. I don't know what they did to earn this, but they may have been put in a terrible situation and not given the gifts or opportunities that I had, and I can just help them. And that feels amazing to actually want to do that of my own accord. I don't even have to credit God with giving me the desire to be good. I can just actually be good. And it feels nice. I really like it.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's amazing.
Now, what was the other? So you talk about freedom and then, bitterness.
Yeah, the bitterness, second half. Yeah.
So I'm bitter, but I struggled with what to be or who to be bitter towards. And I think you and Katie probably struggled with this some because I heard your discussions about growing up in a loving home and parents that didn't abuse you. All of our parents mess us up in one way or another in small ways. But I wasn't ever abused. I wasn't with overly strict parents. They gave me so much. I had so much opportunity. And so I really am thankful to my parents and grandparents for everything they did for me. But then again, they raised me in that fundamentalist way, but my parents, that's the way they were raised. Yeah. And I don't know how my grandparents were raised. I mean, they, to some degree, that was the early 1900s, my grandparents. So it doesn't matter really how they were raised. How much knowledge did you have access to? So I think, I realized that my parents and grandparents did the best they could with the knowledge that they had, and they did a fantastic job. But the two things I'm really mad about, still bitter, was that as a 7-year-old, I knew eternal hell was waiting because I was not a good person, because I was a sinner. And then also the second thing that really makes me bitter is that I was told over and over again by teachers and leaders in the church and preachers and friends' parents, everybody emphasized marry in the church. Don't be unequally yoked to a non-believer. And that affected my whole life. And so those two things I'm really bitter about. Now, how, you want to be bitter at like people or a real, like
something.
There's no destination for that bitterness. That's an idea. And those people that said that didn't have any ill intentions. And so I don't hold anything against them, but I hate those ideas.
Yeah.
That we're all bound to hell by default and that you have to marry within your strict little small sect of the church or you're definitely going to go to hell. That's what I'm bitter about, are those two things, really.
Yeah, definitely. No, that makes total sense. I relate to you a lot on that because just like you said, I don't think my parents did anything wrong. I don't think they traumatized me unnecessarily. I think they were trying to do the best they could, and that was the way they knew how to do the best they could, was teaching me about this religion and all of that. But of course, I totally feel bitter that I learned about hell when I was young too. That's something I really wish that I could remove that piece out of my childhood and just see what the trajectory of my life would have been like without that,
Yeah. I mean, who knows, man? I can't remember ever not knowing about hell.
Right. Yeah. Who knows?
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, part of the motivation to do this and even to have you on and share your story and stuff is hoping that, maybe there's a few young parents who are listening to this conversation who now, because of something that was shared, they won't teach that to their 7-year-old. And now when that 7-year-old grows up, they can have kids and they won't teach that to their little kids. And, and it's a multiplicity effect. And hopefully we can slowly change things, I mean, it's already changing. There's a lot of people leaving the church and a lot of people kind of waking up from this stuff. But yeah, it does feel good to do our part in a way.
It does. It feels great. I always felt guilty about not wanting to spread the good news of the gospel when I was a Christian, because I could not get excited about it. It didn't make sense why
it's bad news. Yeah. It's bad news. Yeah. But I don't want to spread this.
Yeah. But since I became a non-believer and I realized that hell's not waiting on me, I really do want to tell everybody. I want to tell so many people. And I think I tried that at the beginning and they don't really take kindly to that.
Yeah. So they don't want to hear that.
I've had to restrain myself. I'm learning.
All right. Well, is there, thinking back on your whole lifetime of all this is a big question, but is there anything that you wish that you would have done differently as part of this process?
As part of the deconversion process, I guess if you start when the switch was flipped for me and I started using common sense, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have set off the 2 nuclear bombs at once. I mean, that was a lot to put on somebody. I wish I had handled that differently. But again, I don't know how. I don't know what I would do to fix that. Yeah. Because I really did need to go through that deconversion process by myself. I needed to own it. Yeah. And unfortunately, when you do go through it by yourself for a couple of years, you really get to feeling like you're on an island. You really do own it. And you're the only one. You don't know that anybody else is having those problems. And so I don't know that I would have changed anything really. I wish if I could have changed something, I would have changed the 12-year-old David. I would go back and tell him that he zoomed out and he really hit on the problem. The doctrine of atonement through blood sacrifice is a problem. I mean, I didn't know those words back then, but I would have told him, you have hit on a major philosophical problem of Christianity and nobody's talking about it, but pay attention, listen to your gut, go with it, follow those doubts because there's something real there. And, if I had told 12-year-old David, you're going to be back here in, 30 years asking the same question, I don't think I would have believed it, but I wish I could have reached him because that might have changed the trajectory of my life. But that being said, it's hard to argue with where I am in life right now. I mean, I'm pretty successful professionally. I'm happy. So if I change something, man, the unintended consequences might have had deleterious effects. So
True.
I guess not. I have regrets, but I don't know what I'd change.
Yeah. All right. Well, beautiful. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much again for coming on and being willing to talk with me and share all of that. Yeah. And everybody who's listening just really, really appreciates that.
Well, thank you so much for your podcast. I mean, you and Katie, I feel like I know you, even though, this is our second time to speak via Zoom. I've listened to your podcast so many times through and picked up different phrases. And I mean, it plays when I'm sleeping at night because sometimes I just need something on the background and I'll wake up and I know what podcast it's in. And I'm like, I skipped 2 of them. I skipped the one we told the parents. There's so much that I know about the 2 of you. And I want to say thank you for putting all that out there because for me, it's helped me heal a lot. I think when I started listening to y'all, and I know I told you this story, and I'll tell you the story and you can edit it out too. I found your podcast one night in a hotel room when I wasn't sleeping very well. It was 2 a.m. And I was just scrolling through and iTunes suggested your podcast. So, it's got a cool title. I like that. So I'll scroll through the subjects and I found the one on indoctrination. And this was after you'd already gone through all the first season, childhood indoctrination. I'm like, ooh, I'm going to play that one. And I listened to it, and you and Katie go over your inner child work and talk about what seemed like the corniest thing at the time, which is going back to your 12-year-old self or whatever you choose to go back to, and talk to them and tell them. And I actually paused the podcast at that point, and I thought, well, all right, I might as well try it. That seems crazy, but I'm going to try that. And I did, and I went back to 12-year-old David, and I told him to get a little more confident and that he was smart and he was thinking of things that other people hadn't thought of, and that things were going to get better. And he was going to realize the questions he was asking were real questions and they should be addressed, and that he's the one that's actually asking the right questions, and that it was okay to masturbate and okay to look at girls and okay to feel awkward and okay to think cuss words. It's not bad that cuss words are going through your mind. That's just part of being a person, And to tell him that was so emotional at the time. I mean, I started crying in bed at 2 a.m. just when I couldn't sleep, because it really touched me. And so I'll always remember that moment that your podcast brought to me. And I think that made me realize how much I needed a little healing, because I think I had just kind of embraced the bitterness at that point.
Yeah.
And, I was happy, but I was mad at times too. And I still get mad sometimes. But your podcast has really showed me that two people can come through it and be still understanding of other people and not so mad and bitter all the time. And I think I've become a nicer, softer person around the edges because I've been listening to you two for so long. And so I really want to credit you with just the tremendous work that you've done. And the other thing I really like about your story, and I mentioned this earlier, is that you don't have any horrendous trauma that brought you to this point. You're a normal person that went through a normal childhood and normal college and then wound up figuring out that it wasn't real. And, sometimes I can kind of feel like that's not a very interesting story. It's not, to me, it seems huge what I went through. But then when I compare it to other people's stories, it seems tiny. But then to listen to you and Katie talk about all the different emotions on all the different episodes and the different things you have to deal with, it made me realize that my going through what I went through was not insignificant. There's a lot of psychological issues and a lot of discoveries you make, some of them absolutely fantastic, that I got to listen to you and Katie go through. And I heard your progression, as you went through that year of podcast, and to hear your attitudes change. And I just enjoyed it so much. It's been a real source of some healing for me. So thank you very much for putting that out there.
Yeah. I don't know what to even say to that, but I just want to acknowledge that I hear that and I receive that. And that really touches me, and it touches Katie a lot. And that means a lot hearing that. So thanks.
The work you're doing is significant. It helps.
Thank you.